The evening was lit up by hundreds of lights scattered throughout the gardens and the interior of Mr. Almeida's mansion. Guests arrived in luxurious cars, dressed in black tie attire that reflected the event's grandeur. Classical music filled the air, mixed with the sound of clinking glasses as toasts were made. The host greeted everyone with a rehearsed smile, proud of his magnificent home. Everything seemed carefully planned to impress. The garden, in particular, caught everyone's attention. Red roses, white lilies, and colorful daisies created a fairy tale-like setting. The guests complimented every detail, unaware of the quiet, dedicated work the gardener, João, had put in. For Mr. Almeida, the garden wasn't just part of his house, it was a status symbol. He showed it off as if it were the result of his own talent. As he walked through the main hall, Mr. Almeida watched the admiring glances directed his way. He felt empowered by the envy and awe of others. Every word of approval fed his vanity and reinforced his belief that perfection was synonymous with power. Yet behind the imposing facade, there was a constant dissatisfaction. His 6-year-old daughter, Laura, quietly weaved between the guests' legs. Dressed in a delicate blue dress, she observed both the people and the flowers with curiosity. Unlike her father, she didn't see perfection in appearances, but beauty in small details. The gardener, João, who always told her stories about the plants, was an almost magical figure to her. The sound of the orchestra swelled, and the party continued lively. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, while laughter echoed through the hall. An atmosphere of wealth and ostentation hung in the air like a strong, suffocating perfume. Everything was in perfect order. At least, that was the impression Mr. Almeida was determined to maintain for everyone. At that moment, the guests began moving toward the garden. Mr. Almeida, filled with pride, led the group as if he were a guide showcasing a masterpiece. He pointed out every detail with vanity, as if it were solely the result of his own work. From a distance, João watched with a discreet and humble smile. Laura quietly followed the group, but her attention wasn't on the adult conversations. She walked with eyes twinkling at the sight of the flowers, remembering the stories João told her about how each one had a personality of its own. To the little girl, that garden wasn't just beautiful, it was alive, pulsing, almost like a silent family. The cool night air made the moment pleasant, and the guests were even more enchanted by the surroundings. Positive comments filled Mr. Almeida's ears, and he puffed up with pride with every word of admiration. The party seemed on its way to being remembered as a great success. However, as in every story where perfection is idolized, the detail that breaks the facade was just about to appear. While proudly showing off a row of colorful flowers, Mr. Almeida noticed something no one else had. His gaze narrowed, and his smile froze for an instant. There, amidst so many vibrant flowers, a single fallen petal signaled the beginning of a scene that would change everything. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find emotional stories that show how small gestures can transform lives, just like you'll see on this unforgettable night. Mr. Almeida's stare locked onto the wilted flower, as if that small detail were a personal insult. While the guests continued to praise the garden, he felt his anger growing inside. For him, there was no room for imperfections. A single flaw could tarnish his image in the eyes of others. "See how impeccable it all is?" he said, trying to maintain his smile. But inside, his mind was focused only on that small defect. His inflated pride wouldn't allow him to accept that something was out of place. While others saw beauty, he saw only a failure. João, the gardener, watched from a distance with the serenity of someone who had dedicated years of work to the garden. He knew that nature had its own rhythm, and that a wilted flower was just part of the cycle of life. But he also knew his boss's temper and feared what would come next. Laura, meanwhile, didn't sense the growing tension. She was still walking among the flowers, enchanted, laughing softly and bending down to smell each one's fragrance. To the little girl, even the flowers that weren't perfect had value, because they were all part of a greater whole. The host, however, saw no poetry in any of it. The garden was a mirror of his own ego, and any flaw was unacceptable. He felt the need to reassert his authority in front of the guests, because he believed that showing toughness was a sign of power. The guests, unaware of the change in his expression, continued to comment on the vibrant colors, the impeccable organization, and the enchanting perfume. Each compliment felt like a reward, but also a burden, because Mr. Almeida couldn't stand the thought that someone might notice the same flaw he had seen. While disguising his irritation, Almeida began to plan his next move. João would be summoned, and the small stain of imperfection would be punished with severity. The millionaire believed that only public humiliation could show others that he accepted nothing less than absolute perfection. Laura looked at her father at that moment and noticed something strange. His smile was too stiff, and his eyes didn't have the same sparkle as before. Without fully understanding, the little girl felt a tightness in her chest, as if something bad was about to happen. The night, which until then had been a celebration, began to be cast under a shadow. Mr. Almeida's internal silence grew, and the garden seemed to lose some of its charm in the face of his quiet fury. When he finally opened his mouth to call for João, the fate of that party took a different turn. Mr. Almeida's call echoed through the garden, interrupting the guests' conversations. His firm, authoritative voice made everyone look in his direction. João, the gardener, approached quickly, wiping his hands on his worn apron. He knew that when he was called out in public, it rarely meant anything good. "João, explain this to me," said Almeida, pointing a stiff finger at the wilted flower. The scorn in his voice cut through the quiet of the setting. The guests, previously distracted, now all turned to watch the scene. The tension was palpable. The gardener looked at the flower and replied calmly, "Sir, it's just a tired flower. Tomorrow, others will bloom, strong and beautiful." His serene answer, however, sounded like a provocation to his boss, who had expected remorse and fear. Almeida pressed his lips together and furrowed his brow. To him, accepting that as natural was a sign of weakness. He saw no beauty in the cycle of life, only a failure to control every detail. His mind was calculating how to turn that moment into an example of his strictness. The guests murmured among themselves, some surprised by the host's exaggeration, others curious to see how far the scene would go. For many, it was uncomfortable to witness a humble man being exposed under so many stares, but no one dared to intervene. Laura, holding a small blue bow from her dress, watched intently. Her little heart beat faster, not understanding how a simple flower could cause so much anger. To her, it was incomprehensible that her father was treating João with such harshness. Almeida raised his voice, making sure to be heard by all. "In my house, there is no room for carelessness. A wilted flower tarnishes my name. This is incompetence, João, and I will not tolerate it." The words landed like hammer blows, each one heavier than the last.
The gardener lowered his eyes, maintaining his calm, but feeling the shame burning his skin. He wasn't just standing before his employer, but before dozens of people who now looked at him with judgment or pity. In that instant, the festive atmosphere lost its lightness. The garden, which moments before had been a place of enchantment, was now a stage for humiliation. The silence of the guests made every word from Almeida echo even louder. And so, with a single flower, the party's image of perfection began to shatter.
João tried to speak again, but Almeida cut him off with a sharp gesture. No excuses. If you can't even keep a simple flower alive, then maybe you aren't fit to work here. His tone was cutting, his expression full of contempt. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, but no one dared to speak up. The host's position of power was absolute, and everyone preferred to watch in silence. Only Laura seemed restless, biting her lower lip as if she wanted to shout something. The gardener took a deep breath, silently accepting the harsh words. He was used to his boss's demands, but the weight of the humiliation never failed to sting. His dignity was his greatest shield, and even wounded, he held himself firm before everyone. Almeida, in turn, felt empowered by reasserting his authority. To him, showing toughness was a sign of respect. He didn't notice, however, the disapproving glances beginning to form among some of the more sensitive guests. "You're fired, João," he suddenly declared, his loud voice making the announcement echo like a verdict. The gardener's heart sank, but he maintained his composure, simply bowing his head. The injustice burned, but submission was his only possible response. Hearing the sentence, Laura felt tears well up in her eyes. The thought of losing the friend who taught her about every flower was unbearable. She couldn't understand how something so small could lead to such a cruel decision. The guests, uneasy, glanced at one another as if seeking justification for the scene in each other's eyes. Some smiled nervously, others pretended to be distracted, but everyone knew they were witnessing an overreaction. The silence that followed was heavy. The party, until then so vibrant, seemed to have lost its soul. The sounds of the orchestra and the clinking glasses felt distant against the scene unfolding in the garden. João took a deep breath, ready to accept the fate imposed upon him. But before he could walk away, a small pair of feet came running toward him. It was Laura, bringing with her the hope that this story would not end in silence. After Almeida's sentence, a deep silence fell over the garden. The guests, once so talkative and cheerful, now seemed paralyzed by the tension. No one knew how to react in face of such severity. The atmosphere, which had been festival, had transformed into a stage for collective embarrassment. João kept his head bowed, feeling the weight of the stares piercing him like blades. Some were full of pity, others of judgment, but all placed him in an inferior position. Even so, his dignity remained intact, sustained by the serenity of someone who knew the value of honest work.
Almeida, on the other hand, felt in control. To him, this public display of authority was necessary to maintain his image of perfection. He didn't realize, however, that his attitude was already starting to make many of the guests uncomfortable. His pride was blinding him. The more sensitive guests looked away, trying to disguise their discomfort. Some whispered discreetly, commenting that perhaps his behavior had been too harsh. But no one had the courage to confront the host directly. Laura, her eyes glistening with tears, watched the scene. The little girl couldn't understand how such a small detail could cause so much sadness. Her child's soul could see clearly something the adults preferred to ignore, the blatant injustice happening right in front of everyone. The gardener took a deep breath, struggling to keep his emotions in check. His relationship with the garden was more than just a job, it was a passion. Every flower held meaning for him, and to see his work reduced to an unfair accusation hurt more than any material loss. The orchestra continued to play, but the sound of the notes no longer had the same effect. The sound of the notes felt out of place, almost inappropriate given the weight of the scene. Even the waiters moved more slowly, as if the very air was thick with tension. The silence, heavy with expectation, made it clear that something needed to happen to break the suffocating mood. Everyone was waiting for Almeida's next move, or perhaps an unexpected reaction from João. But the one to take the next step would be neither of them. It would be someone much smaller in size, but infinitely greater in heart. Laura took a deep breath and discreetly wiped the tears that threatened to fall. Her eyes fixed on her father, who stood like a rigid statue, unaware of the weight of his own words. Then she turned her gaze to João, her quiet friend who always had time to show her the secrets of the flowers. The little girl's heart felt tight. She remembered when João had taught her that even the most fragile flowers needed rest, just like people. To her, that made perfect sense. So why couldn't her father understand? While the adults remained silent, Laura began to walk slowly towards the flower bed. Her light footsteps caught the attention of some guests who began to watch her quietly. The contrast between the child's purity and the father's rigidity became more and more evident. Almeida noticed his daughter's movement and furrowed his brow. "Laura, go back to your mother," he said, trying to sound firm. But the girl didn't obey. She kept walking, determined as if she knew exactly what needed to be done.
She knelt before the wilted flower, touching it with the gentleness of someone holding something precious. Her small fingers carefully picked it, as if wanting to protect it from the cruel world that had condemned it. The guests held their breath, watching the scene intently. The silence deepened, and even the distracted musicians fumbled a few notes under the tension of the moment. The atmosphere seemed frozen, with every gaze fixed on the little girl. Laura held the flower with both hands, raising it like a small treasure. Her eyes shone with the purity of someone who saw no flaw, but only a living thing that deserved respect. The flower, even wilted, seemed to take on new meaning in her hands. She rose slowly and began walking toward her father. Each step echoed, a quiet challenge to the heavy silence that dominated the garden. When she stopped in front of him, everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Laura stood before her father, holding the wilted flower as if it were a precious gift. Her little eyes shone, not with fear, but with a pure courage that came from innocence. The contrast between the child's fragility and the millionaire's hardness was so great that the guests' silence deepened even further. Almeida tried to maintain his authoritative posture. "Laura, what are you doing? This is no time for games." His voice sounded firm, but there was a slight hesitation. The girl didn't back down. She held the flower with both hands, as if carrying a message too important to ignore. João, watching from a distance, felt a lump in his throat. He knew the special connection Laura had with the garden. To see the little girl stand before her father was, for him, an act of courage no adult had dared. The guests, previously passive spectators, were now completely captivated. Every stare was fixed on Laura, eagerly waiting to hear what would come from her mouth. The luxurious party had transformed into a silent courtroom, with a child at its center. Laura raised the flower to chest height and smiled softly. To her, there was nothing wrong with that tired petal. On the contrary, there was a beauty the adults seemed incapable of seeing. Her little heart beat fast, but her voice came out steady. "Dad, look how beautiful she is, even when she's tired. Uncle Joan takes care of all of them, but this one just wanted to rest."
Her words, simple and direct, cut through the air like an arrow. The guests held their breath. The innocence of her statement contrasted brutally with the harshness of the prior humiliation. Some eyes already glistened with emotion, while others looked away to hide the impact. But Mr. Almeida couldn't reply immediately. His daughter had done what no one else dared: challenge his authority without fear, and yet do it with sweetness. In that instant, the atmosphere of the party had changed forever.
Laura looked directly into her father's eyes and finished. "She's as tired as your heart is when you shout. Everybody gets tired, Dad, even the flowers." The metaphor, born from childhood purity, struck everyone present like a bolt from the blue. The silence that followed was heavier than any speech. Mr. Almeida's face paled, and for the first time that night, his powerful posture seemed to falter. His daughter's words echoed in his mind like a broken mirror, revealing all the cracks in his rigidness. The guests were visibly moved. Some whispered softly, others just watched in reverent silence. It was impossible not to feel the weight of those words. No amount of luxury, music, or ostentation could overshadow the impact of a child's innocence. João, still with his head bowed, raised his eyes to watch the scene. A discreet tear traced a path down his face, weathered by hard work. He had never imagined he would be defended not by adults, but by a 6-year-old girl who saw the world more justly than anyone present. Almeida tried to say something, but his voice failed him. His pride, accustomed to dominating every situation, was now at war with his shame. The image of the ruthless man was beginning to crumble before the watchful eyes of his guests. Laura, unaware of the weight of her words, continued to hold the flower tenderly. To her, the gesture was natural, simple, just a way of showing her father that even imperfection deserved respect. But to everyone else, it was an act of pure wisdom. The prolonged silence turned into anticipation. What would Mr. Almeida do in the face of his own daughter's revelation? The entire party seemed to be waiting for his response, as if it were a final judgment. The girl's eyes, full of innocence, showed no fear, only love and sincerity. It was impossible to look away from that gaze. And so, with a wilted flower in a child's hands, the hardened heart of a millionaire began to crack. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the silence after Laura's words. The sound of the orchestra had faded from the guests' awareness, as if reality had paused to listen to a child. Everyone waited for the outcome of that moment with a tightness in their chests. Mr. Almeida's face was rigid, but not with the same pride as before. He felt a lump in his throat, something he wasn't used to dealing with. Shame. His daughter's metaphor had pierced his emotional armor and exposed his own failings for all to see.
Some guests began discreetly dabbing at tears that welled up. The purity of the little girl's words held an undeniable power, far greater than any elaborate speech. It was simplicity that revealed the truth, and that truth weighed heavily on everyone. João, standing perfectly still, felt his heart racing. He would never have had the courage to say something like that to his boss, but Laura had done it without hesitation. It was as if she had given a voice to his dignity, transforming his humiliation into strength. Mr. Almeida took deep breaths, trying to compose himself. But the more he tried to cling to his pride, the more he realized he was losing control of the situation. His daughter's gaze, sweet yet firm, offered him no escape. Laura held the flower gently, as if protecting it was the most important thing in the world. To her, there was no audience, only her father and the need to make him understand. Her simple gesture had already disarmed the entire atmosphere. The tension was almost palpable. Everyone present knew the millionaire was at a crossroads: maintain his rigidity and deepen the injustice, or acknowledge that even a powerful man could be wrong. The seconds dragged like minutes. Almeida's face, once impenetrable, began to show cracks. His jaw trembled slightly, betraying the internal struggle, and then for the first time, he lowered his eyes, unable to hold his own daughter's gaze. Inside, Almeida felt as if a war were raging. On one side, his pride screamed for him to maintain his composure in front of the guests. On the other, his newly awakened conscience, stirred by his daughter's innocence, pleaded for humanity. He had always believed perfection was synonymous with respect. Since his youth, he had learned to never show weakness. But there, facing Laura, all of that seemed to lose its meaning. How could he teach his daughter anything when she was giving him the greatest lesson of all? The weight of their stares was suffocating. Everyone present seemed to be waiting for his final reaction, and the silence demanded an immediate response. Almeida felt cold sweat trickling down his neck, something unprecedented at the parties he always dominated with absolute confidence. He remembered the past, when he was a child and heard from his own father that mistakes were unacceptable. Perhaps, without realizing it, he had become the exact reflection of what he had most feared. That memory hurt more than any criticism. Meanwhile, Laura remained there, steadfast, the wilted flower in her hands. Her presence was a living reminder that even fragility had value. She didn't need to say anything more. Her gesture said it all. Joao watched in silence, praying that his boss would find the courage to change. This would be the chance to transform not just the party, but his very relationship with life itself.
Almeida's heart was racing. He knew he was about to lose the battle against his own pride. But there was something liberating about it, as if admitting his failure was, finally, his chance to become a better man. He slowly raised his eyes and looked at Joao. The weight of his shame was immense, but for the first time, there was a trace of humility in his expression. A decision was about to be made, and everyone there knew that nothing would be the same after it. The silence hung over the garden like an unbearable weight. Almeida stared intently at Joao, then at his daughter, as if searching their faces for an answer he couldn't find within himself. His pride was still screaming, but something inside him had shifted forever. The guests remained motionless, waiting. Some had tears in their eyes, others simply held their breath. The scene had transformed into an unexpected spectacle, far more powerful than any music or banquet that night. Laura, still holding the wilted flower, stood before her father. Her gaze was serene, yet unyielding. She asked for nothing more than understanding, but that simplicity made her presence overwhelming. Almeida felt his heart pound. For the first time, he didn't know how to act in front of so many people. The man who always had a ready answer for everything was silent, defeated by the innocent love of a little girl. He raised his arm as if to say something, but his voice failed him. A discreet cough served to disguise the lump in his throat. This was the hardest fight he had ever faced, not against another man, but against himself. Joao watched attentively. His eyes reflected hope, but also resignation. He knew he might leave there without a job, but he already felt honored just by the little girl's gesture. The seconds felt eternal. The tension had reached its limit, and any word from Almeida could change the course of the night, leading either to redemption or to an even greater ruin of his image. Finally, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and allowed himself to falter, not before others, but before himself. And when he opened his eyes, everyone could see. This was no longer the same man who had humiliated the gardener just minutes before. Mr. Almeida walked slowly over to João, who remained silent, his head bowed. The millionaire stopped in front of him, took a deep breath, and with a choked voice said, "João, please forgive me. I was wrong."
The words, simple and rare from his lips, echoed through the garden with more power than any shout. The guests' eyes widened in surprise, and the silence was broken by a murmur of astonishment. Laura smiled with relief and clutched the flower even tighter in her hands. To her, it was as if her father had finally understood the message hidden in that tired petal. "You don't just take care of my garden," Almeida continued, his voice firmer now. "You keep it alive, and that is far more than I ever valued. Starting today, you will be the supervisor of the entire team." The unexpected promotion left everyone speechless. João looked up, overcome with emotion. His lips trembled, and for a few seconds he couldn't speak. He simply shook his head in gratitude, discreet tears streaming down his face. The dignity that had been stripped from him moments before was now returned to him with even greater honor. The guests burst into applause, first timidly, then strong and unanimous. That moment had become the highlight of the party, not because of the opulence, but because of the humanity that had finally bloomed amidst the luxury. Almeida turned to his daughter and picked her up in his arms. "You showed me what I couldn't see, Laura. Thank you, my little one." His voice, now gentle, contrasted with the harshness he had shown before. Happy, Laura pressed the flower against her father's chest and said softly, "Everybody needs to rest, Dad, even you." And for the first time in a long while, Mr. Almeida smiled not to impress, but because he had found a piece of peace within himself. The applause echoed through the garden, finally shattering the stiffness that had dominated the party until then. Some guests wept quietly, others smiled with emotion. It was impossible not to be moved by the unexpected scene. The night, which had begun as a display of power, had now transformed into a lesson in humanity. Many approached João to congratulate him. For the first time, the gardener received looks of respect instead of condescension. Every handshake and every word of admiration restored the dignity that had been taken from him minutes before. Almeida watched it all with a strange feeling. Accustomed to being the center of attention because of his wealth, he now realized that true greatness came from an act of humility. The pride that once consumed him seemed small in the face of the gratitude reflected on the faces around him. The orchestra's music started again, but now it sounded different. It had lightness. It had sincerity. Even the waiters moved with more joy, as if the weight that had hung over the party had finally lifted.
Laura ran between the guests, laughing and giving out hugs. The little girl didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what she had done, but she knew something good had happened. To her, saving the flower and Uncle João was just what her heart told her to do. Some guests whispered to each other that they had never witnessed anything so meaningful at a luxury party. Others remarked that this night would be remembered not for the jewels or the food, but for the courage of a child who had softened the heart of a powerful man. João, deeply moved, looked at Laura with tenderness. He knew he would never forget her gesture. To him, the little girl was like a small flower in the garden of life, bringing hope where there had once been only hardness. Meanwhile, Almeida, still holding his daughter, felt the weight of an internal shift. He realized that for the first time, he had no control over what people would remember about the party, and he found he didn't mind. In that moment, he felt proud not of his wealth, but of his daughter. And so, the atmosphere of coldness and ostentation had been replaced by an unexpected human warmth. With his daughter in his arms, Almeida walked slowly through the garden. With each step, he noticed details that had previously escaped his attention. They weren't just well-kept flowers, but lives that João had preserved with quiet dedication. He turned to the gardener and said loudly, "João, this garden was never just mine, it was always yours too. I was blinded by vanity, but now I know I must thank you for every bit of beauty everyone here admires." His words drew fresh applause from the crowd. João smiled humbly, but deep down he finally felt seen. It wasn't just about the job title or the salary, but about respect. For the first time, he felt valued not as a mere employee, but as an essential part of the household. Laughing, Laura placed the wilted flower in her father's hands. "Keep it, Dad, so you never forget that even flowers need to rest." The simple gesture carried more weight than any speech. Almeida held the flower as if it were the most precious object in his life. Touched, the guests drew even closer, transforming the party into a collective moment of reflection. Some commented on how the little girl's words had made them think about their own lives, their own demands and pressures. Almeida, who had always believed that displays of power were his greatest weapon, now understood that his greatest strength lay in learning from his daughter's innocence. His pride didn't vanish overnight, but that evening had planted a seed of change.
Deeply moved, João approached and placed a hand on his employer's shoulder. "Thank you, sir, but the one who taught us all today wasn't me. It was your daughter." Almeida looked at Laura and felt his eyes well up. The little girl smiled innocently, unaware that she had transformed not just the party, but the hearts of everyone present. And in that moment, everyone understood. True greatness lay not in luxury, but in the purity of truth spoken by a child. The party was nearing its end, but no one would leave with the same perspective they had arrived with. The night, planned as a mere display of wealth and status, was ending as a landmark of reflection and humanity. The guests said their goodbyes, still discussing the scene they had witnessed, certain they would never forget it. João, now promoted to supervisor, walked quietly through the garden. He touched some flowers as one might caress an old friend. For him, this moment wasn't just a personal victory, but proof that dignity and respect always find a way, even in the most difficult situations. Mr. Almeida remained seated on a stone bench, holding the wilted flower Laura had given him. He observed it with a different perspective, as if it were an eternal reminder that not everything needs to be perfect to be valuable. That small, tired petal had transformed his life. Laura, tired after so much emotion, rested her head on her father's lap. He tenderly stroked her hair, feeling an immense love that seemed greater than all the wealth he possessed. For the first time, Almeida understood the true meaning of being a father. The guests departed carrying not just memories of a party, but of a lesson. Many reflected on their own attitudes, their excessive demands, and their relationships. The scene of the child defending the gardener would spread as a story to be told at many dinner tables. The garden, illuminated by small lanterns, seemed more alive than ever. Each flower seemed to smile discreetly, as if it too had witnessed the miracle of change. Even the wilted flower, now in Almeida's hands, had a place of honor. João approached his employer and said quietly,
The flowers teach us that there is beauty even in weakness. Thank you for listening, even if it was through your daughter's voice. Almeida nodded, moved, without words to respond. Laura, almost asleep, murmured, "Dad, tomorrow the garden will smile again." Then she closed her eyes, peaceful, as if she already knew everything was at peace. The night ended not with the glitter of jewels, nor with the luxury of the mansion, but with eternal memory that true wealth lies in the heart. Did this story touch your heart? Then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every video brings a lesson that might change how you see life. Click now, because the next story might be exactly what you need to hear today.